Hello, good morning. Welcome to Sky News Breakfast. A 7-year-old girl is fighting for her life after being caught up in a drive-by shooting in North London. Witnesses have described how people who'd gathered for a memorial service were sent running and screaming by the gunshots. Home Secretary Suella Braverman says she's deeply concerned by the incident. We spoke to witnesses who said they heard shots and saw a car drive away from the scene.
We heard like a loud, a sound, but I didn't really take anything into it. And then my friend was like, wait, was that a gunshot? We literally saw like people and like kids like running towards this direction. So we're like, nah, let's come back upstairs. But then while we were downstairs, we literally saw like this black Mercedes literally sped off.
Sky's Aisha Zahid is at the scene in North London for us now. And Aisha, just bring us up to date with the latest that we have on the victims and indeed the suspects.
Well, we know that there were 6 people injured in this shooting, and we know that one 7-year-old is in a life-threatening condition in hospital, as well as that a 48-year-old woman is believed to have sustained life-changing injuries. It's an incredibly upsetting and shocking incident taking place in this community, something that you wouldn't expect to happen, let alone in broad daylight. The incident is believed to have happened Saturday afternoon. Around 1:30 is when emergency services were called, and the Metropolitan Police say that the shots were believed to have been fired from a moving vehicle in the vicinity of a church where a memorial service was taking place. Now, the local MP and Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has reacted to the incident on Twitter. He tweeted, "I am deeply shocked by the shooting in Euston and want to thank the emergency services for their response. My thoughts are with the victims." So there is still very much a strong police presence here, a cordon in place here on Phoenix Road, and also backing onto Eversholt Street, as well as police continue to investigate to determine exactly what happened. They're appealing for any information, that's any video footage, any CCTV anyone may have to help determine and put together the events that took place yesterday.
Aisha, thank you. Ukrainian officials say at least 14 people have been killed by a Russian missile strike on a residential block in Dnipro. Rescue workers have been working in freezing conditions to recover people from the wreckage, including more than 60 injured. Dnipro was one of a number of cities targeted by a wave of strikes by Moscow yesterday night. Well, meanwhile, Britain has made its first commitment to send tanks to aid the war effort, as our security and defence editor Deborah Haynes reports.
Homes crushed in a Russian missile strike, far away from the front line. This horror in Dnipro was condemned by Ukraine's president, who stressed the need for more powerful Western weapons to help his troops win. This is the kind of weapon he has in mind. Britain's Challenger 2 main battle tank, pictured here exercising in Estonia. In his phone call with Volodymyr Zelensky, Rishi Sunak pledged to give 14 of the tanks to Ukraine. The number is small, but the move is significant, marking the first time Ukrainian troops will receive Western tanks. The UK also plans to supply Ukraine with more artillery, 30 of these AS-90 self-propelled guns.
It shows that we are now less risk-averse in upgrading our support for Ukraine, less spooked, I suppose, by Putin's rhetoric that any serious Western involvement could have repercussions and the war might dangerously escalate.
Russia was quick to issue a warning, saying bringing tanks to the conflict zone, far from drawing the hostilities to a close, will only serve to intensify combat operations. One of those most wary about escalation is this man, Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz, on a visit to Kyiv last year. Yet he's under growing pressure to allow German-made tanks to join the fight. It's not a done deal yet, But the UK has just made it a bit harder for Berlin to say no. Deborah Hames, Sky News.
Breaking news this morning, at least 16 people have died in a plane crash in Nepal. A passenger plane carrying 72 people, 68 passengers and 4 crew members went down in Pokhara in the west of the country. A spokesperson for the airline operator, Yeti, has said there were 10 foreign nationals on board. Authorities are working through the wreckage of the aircraft, which had been en route from the capital, Kathmandu. We will bring you the latest as and when we get it. Nursing union leaders have warned that twice as many nurses will go on strike in early February unless there's progress in pay negotiations. The head of the Royal College of Nursing says the Prime Minister's position over the deadlock in talks is baffling and reckless. Our People and Politics correspondent Nick Martin has the details.
Well, this is clearly an attempt by the Royal College of Nursing to pile on the pressure onto the government to try to come to some kind of resolution in this dispute. The Royal College of Nursing have said that if they cannot come to an agreement with the government, then they will potentially double the amount of nurses who will be eligible to stage strike action in early February. Now, that could have a significant impact. This potentially could make the government sit up and listen. Pat Cullen, the General Secretary of the Royal College of Nursing, has made no secret of the fact that she's not happy with the way the government have, in her words, showed lack of engagement on this issue. Being quoted in a newspaper today, she says Rishi Sunak's intransience is baffling, reckless and politically ill-considered. The nurse shortage costs lives. Sunak cannot put a price on a safe NHS. Now, the demands are quite significant. The Royal College of Nursing are asking for a 19% pay rise, something the Prime Minister has called, quotes, obviously unaffordable. But nevertheless, the strike dates are going to continue. Nurses expected to walk out next Wednesday and Thursday, then February the 6th. Now, in the meantime, an interesting story in The Observer today. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, reportedly having private conversations with the unions in which he has been encouraging them to put pressure on the Treasury and Number 10 to press for more money that might enable some kind of an agreement. Sarah Gorton, the head of health at Unison, one of the biggest health unions, said that on a meeting last Monday, Steve Barclay talked about them asking to make the case to the Treasury. Now, the problem here is that the Treasury hold the purse strings. Money has been allocated to the NHS this year. This could be a sign that Steve Barclay is willing to compromise, but he knows the reality is that there could only be a resolution if there is more money in the pot.
Nick Martin there. Meanwhile, teachers in England have reportedly backed plans to strike next month. The National Education Union balloted 300,000 members, and the Sunday Times says the result is in favour of strike action. The union has not yet confirmed the result, which will be announced tomorrow. Well, this morning, Sophie Rage will be joined by the Transport Secretary Mark Harper, the Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary Peter Kyle, Dr Philip Barnfield of the British Medical Association and the Chairman of Tesco, John Allen. That will be this morning from 8:30. Some updates on that breaking news were brought to you earlier, and at least 16 people have died in a plane crash in Nepal. A passenger plane carrying 72 people, 68 passengers and 4 crew members went down in Pokhara in the west of this country. A spokesperson for the airline operator Yeti has said that there were 10 foreign nationals on board. And the latest we have heard from a Nepal airport official that there were 5 Indian nationals, 4 Russian nationals, 1 Irish and 2 South Korean, and also 1 Australian, 1 French and 1 Argentinian nationals on board. The authorities are currently working through the wreckage of the aircraft, which had been en route from the capital, Kathmandu. We will bring you the latest as and when we get it. Thousands of protesters have gathered in Tel Aviv to rally against the new government's plans to overhaul the legal system. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu launched proposals to weaken the country's Supreme Court by giving Parliament the power to overturn court decisions with a simple majority vote. Romanian authorities have seized cars belonging to the British-American influencer Andrew Tate. Tate was detained last month on sex trafficking charges. Police took 11 limousines, 2 Mercedes and a Rolls-Royce from his property near Bucharest. Drivers are being warned to expect to see a growing number of potholes due to the large amount of rainfall either side of last month's cold weather. The RAC says December created the perfect recipe for potholes to start pepping the roads. But the Department for Transport says there's a potholes fund. The O2 Academy in Brixton says it's going to stay shut for another 3 months. This is after 2 people died in a crowd crush there. Security guard Gabby Hutchinson and Rebecca Ikumello were killed when crowds, which included fans without tickets, gathered at a show by singer Ashaki at the venue last month. The nephew of a British-Iranian man executed in Iran has described his killing as a political game. Alireza Akbari was sentenced to death on charges of spying for the UK. After temporarily recalling the ambassador, the British government is now considering what further action to take against the regime. John Sparks reports.
The facts are disputed, but the consequences are clear. A national of Iran and Britain, Alireza Akbari, was executed. News of his death was broadcast to the country on national TV. Mr. Akbari was one of Britain's most important spies, says this presenter. He knowingly sold secrets abroad, a claim that is vigorously disputed by his family.
It is a political game. It was a political game. He was somebody that was involved with the regime from the very beginning of its foundation. He was holding senior positions. Somebody like that was dedicated to the country and to the regime.
He was arrested in 2019, but details of his detention and death sentence were only revealed this week. Iranian television had the story, however, broadcasting this obituary. We see Akbari in this meeting, reconstructed for the cameras, speaking to a British agent wearing a blonde wig. Finally, the former official is seen signing his confession papers, although he told family members on the phone it was forced by means of torture. This is the first time in decades that a senior Iranian official has been hanged. Akbari charged and executed for corruption on earth, a catch-all for crimes like treason. 4 others have been executed after their involvement in anti-government protests, this time for waging war against God, and some think the two are related. Akbari's death, a means to deflect attention.
The regime does anything that it can, unfortunately, to suppress the population, but also to distract the global perspective on what is actually happening to the people in the country.
According to the British government, the regime is responsible for heinous human rights violations, and it has responded by temporarily withdrawing the ambassador.
We take this incredibly seriously, and of course, we will make sure that we respond to deter any further actions like this being taken by the Iranian government.
Yet the clerics who run Iran will not give way voluntarily as they deal with their purported enemies at home and abroad. John Sparks, Sky News.
Well, let's get more on this now with Dan Pledge, who's Professor of Diplomacy and Strategy at SOAS University of London. It's great to have you here on Sky News. Thank you very much indeed. Now, talking about Mr. Akbari, he worked for the regime for decades. His family says he was committed to it. So shouldn't that have provided him with a certain level of security?
Well, it might be expected to. I think that if we're looking at Mr. Akbari's nephew, I think, described the situation very well. Unfortunately, I think the British government's reaction has not been the wisest. The most important thing the British government has done with respect to Iran recently is to cancel BBC World Service, Iranian service, which is a crucial soft power measure to communicate with the people of Iran, who are in a situation of increasing revolt and revolution against the hardline regime. And if Mr. Cleverly and Mr. Sunak really wanted to influence Iran, then they would redouble the output of the BBC Persian service and possibly add a television dimension, rather than engaging in this extremely inflammatory rhetoric. And if I may, Vanessa, the rhetoric coming from the British government really dances to the regime in Tehran's tune, because they want to have Britain as the bad guy, making a huge fuss, and by making a huge fuss, reinforcing their line about poor Mr. Akbari. So from a diplomatic perspective, what the UK government is doing is very counterproductive.
Well, let's explore that line further than what you were just saying about the British government's response not being the wisest. What further actions do you think that we should be having? I mean, you have alluded to some of them, but what do you make of the sanctions that have been put in place currently? How much further should we be going?
Well, if you had to choose between restoring and expanding BBC World Service, excuse me, I know we're on Sky here, but restoring and expanding BBC transmissions in Persian and Arabic is probably the most important thing one can do to support the heroic women and others of Iran by providing and keeping going this vital communications tool. Whereas yet another round of sanctions, and one has to ask, after all these years, quite what further sanctions can be effective. That the communication strategy would be more useful. Targeting a particular prosecutor, well, it's better to contact and target particular individuals than entire populations. That is more effective. But in general, using words like barbaric, after all, our closest allies, the United States and Saudi Arabia, for example, do execute people. So quite what is barbaric beyond the fact that these are presumably trumped up charges, or that is the allegation. But this kind of language plays into the idea of the evil Britain interfering once again in Iranian affairs, and the narrative that the revolution against the hardliners is somehow orchestrated from outside.
And so it begs the question, what is Iran's motivation then behind this killing? Because obviously they know that this will sour relations.
Well, Vanessa, I think the poor gentleman's nephew, I think, put his finger on it quite probably, which is that the regime wants to portray the UK and the US as always as the evil enemy. And so this execution and the broadcasting of presumed but possibly fabricated confessions and so forth feeds into that narrative that he's an evil British agent, and that it's Britain and its allies who are to blame for the situation in Iran, and that people protesting against the regime are somehow tools. And by using the most inflammatory language externally, one is simply dancing to that tune. So it's very naive, I think, from Mr. Cleverly and Mr. Sunak.
Dan Pledge, who's Professor of Diplomacy and Strategy at SOAS University of London. Grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Now, some more breaking news on the plane crash in Nepal this morning. And the country's aviation authorities have revealed that the death toll has gone up. 40 bodies have now been recovered from the wreckage. The aircraft had been carrying 72 people, 68 passengers and 4 crew members, which went down in Pokhara in the west of the country. A spokesperson for the airline operator Yeti has said that there were several foreign nationals on board. We have heard from a Nepal airport official that there are 5 Indian nationals, 4 Russians, 2 South Koreans, an Australian, a French national and an Argentinian, as well as an Irish national. Here are the latest pictures then that we have from the scene. As you can see, smoke billowing there. Authorities are working through the wreckage of the aircraft, which had been en route from the capital, Kathmandu. We are staying across this story for you, and we'll bring you more as and when we get it. Do stay with us for that. More than 300 flood warnings and alerts are in place across the UK A yellow warning for ice is also in place across Scotland and north of England, with the cold front set to cover most of the UK next week. Well, let's bring in our Skies meteorologist, Kirsty McCabe. And Kirsty, it's not sounding good on that cold front there. Just give us more details on what we can expect and when.
Morning, Vanessa. It's not going to be as intense as the cold spell we saw last month, but it is set to turn much colder and quite a change compared to the wet and windy and quite mild weather we've had of late. It's good news, though, for those areas affected by flooding. There's less rain on the forecast, but it is going to turn much colder. And let me show you why. It's all down to the jet stream. Now, normally this zone of very strong winds high in the atmosphere moves fairly west-east across the UK. It's going to be buckling further south of us as we head through the next few days. And as it dives south towards Europe, it drags in much colder Arctic air from the north. So although the weather's going to be settling down, it is going to turn significantly colder as we drag in this cold Arctic air mass. So you can see the blues on the chart. And that means we're looking at frosty conditions, ice, as you've mentioned, risk of snow as well. We've got some snow showers coming to northern Scotland today. We've got some rain and wet snow and sleet further south across parts of Ireland, northern England, later into Wales. And temperatures today, well, around, say, 5 to 7 Celsius, and a widespread frost tonight. As you mentioned, that ice warning is in place. Temperatures could be as low as -12 in the sheltered glens, and the cold weather set to stay until at least Thursday, and that's when we should see milder air returning from the west, but could bring some snow with it first.
Oh my goodness, Kirsty, thank you. Welcome back. Chinese officials say nearly 60,000 people with COVID-19 have died in hospitals since its dropped to zero COVID policy last month. The admission comes following criticism of the state for not releasing accurate coronavirus data since the policy change. Well, joining me now is Dr. Deepsi Gurdasani, who's a clinical epidemiologist and senior lecturer at Queen Mary University of London. Thank you for your time this morning. What are the ramifications of China lifting these sanctions? Are we likely to see new variants emerging?
I mean, it's entirely possible. What we've seen here was entirely foreseeable. We saw a large country, which had a zero COVID policy, which was maintained largely through lockdowns, masks, and mass testing, move very quickly to essentially lifting all mitigations. And what we've seen is mass spread through the population. So I think it's estimated that 900 million people in China have been infected. And we know that as the virus moves and transmits, it has it mutates every time that it transmits, and this provides huge possibilities for the virus to mutate, particularly in a background population that doesn't have a high level of immunity to the virus. While vaccination rates overall are high in China, we know, for example, that they're quite low in the elderly population. So the high number of cases has predictably translated to a high number of deaths. And we expect the death figures to continue to rise, and potentially the actual number of deaths could even be higher than what the official estimates state.
And China reporting 60,000 deaths since lifting a zero COVID policy. I mean, how worried should we be by these figures coming out of China? And indeed, many people question those figures coming out of China. Many fear that the number could be higher.
It is very concerning. And before this, we were told that there'd been about 5,000 deaths. So there's been a huge sort of jump in what we're being told. And 60,000 deaths in a very short period of 5 weeks in itself would be very, very concerning. But it's very likely, as you say, that the figures are actually higher because we haven't had a lot of transparency from the government during this period. They're not actually reporting the exact number of cases every day. We're not seeing absolute number of deaths being reported on a daily basis. Rather, we're getting this sort of official news at particular intervals, which shows sudden jumps in the number of deaths. Meanwhile, we're hearing within China that hospitals are being overwhelmed in some places, but there's very little news that's getting out of China. So it's very hard to know, apart from the official estimates, what's actually going on.
And in the UK, I think many people appear to think that the era of COVID is behind us, but the reality is that it's not. Are we in danger of being complacent?
Absolutely. I mean, what we're seeing in the UK are not just the acute impacts, which are significant. I mean, Omicron, which was deemed mild, caused more than 33,000 deaths from COVID in 2022, but we're seeing an era of chronic disease. So we are seeing, for example, 2 million people now living with long COVID. A large number of those have had illness for more than a year or potentially even 2 years. We are seeing excess deaths every single week. So, for example, the last week of Christmas, we had 3,000 excess deaths, some because of COVID, some because of flu, some potentially because of long-term impacts of COVID, and some because of the huge pressures on the NHS and the breakdown of the NHS, which is at least partly related to the pandemic and the continuing high level of hospitalizations and infections that we're seeing within hospital with COVID.
And what lesson do you think that we've learned from the height of the pandemic, or at least should have learned from the height of the pandemic, that we should avoid repeating?
I mean, I don't think enough lessons have been learned, because I think the lesson that we should be learning now is this living with it strategy isn't working. We had 5 waves in the UK in 2022, and all of them were associated with significant disruption to the health service, significant number of deaths, as well as huge chronic disease burden. I mean, this is a disease that affects every single system of your body long term. So what we need to be learning is air quality regulation. We need to adapt to the virus. Letting it spread is not living with it. We need air cleaning, air sterilization technologies. We need infrastructure to allow for better ventilation. We need to change our lifestyle to be doing more outdoors. We need people to be wearing well-fitting, high-quality masks that really reduce the spread of the virus. And we need testing and support with isolation provided by government alongside vaccination. The government has unfortunately adopted a vaccine-only strategy that has led us to where we are, which is still continuing to have high numbers of deaths and high levels of chronic disease and huge pressures on the NHS, all of which is unacceptable.
Godetani, thank you very much indeed. Nearly 60% of unpaid carers are struggling to make ends meet. A recent report from the House of Lords says unpaid carers are filling the void in social care. But during a severe cost of living crisis, many households are being badly affected, as Milena Veselinovic reports.
When her mum got sick, Denise gave up her job to look after her. But that also meant giving up her livelihood. And with no financial support from the government, her savings were quickly drained.
We rely absolutely wholly and solely on mum's state pension and her disability benefits. You're not building up any savings. You're not paying anything into a pension fund. You are thinking, well, what happens? And also, what happens when mum does pass?
There's another one.
Concerns shared by millions of other unpaid carers who, like Denise, can't fit work with caring, though their Labour campaigners say props up social care.
The system would absolutely collapse without unpaid family carers. 7 million across the UK, and they are providing all manner of support. Otherwise, people would be in hospital. They would need far more help from local government, from social care sources.
Despite that, about half of unpaid carers don't get any state support, and those that qualify get just under £70 a week, compensation that peers say doesn't match their contribution. Unpaid carers are filling the void in government social care, according to a new report by the House of Lords, and that is putting financial, physical and emotional pressure on those carers who the report says are at a breaking point. But the government says they are giving support, telling us in a statement, since 2010 we have increased carers' allowance, putting an additional £800 a year in carers' pockets, while the amount someone can earn while remaining eligible for the support has increased by around a third in that period. The cost of caring, though, is not just financial.
I always feel very guilty that she's had to give up so much for me. She's not got any social life. She hasn't had the prospects of her career as she could have had. She has had to give up an awful lot for me.
A feeling of guilt that many of those cared for share. Milena Veselinovic, Sky News.
Watching Sky News Breakfast coming up. We'll be taking a look through this morning's papers with the help of the UK editor of The Big Issue magazine, Paul McNamee, and sociologist Ashley Frawley. Welcome back. Plenty to talk about in today's papers. Joining me to go through them, UK editor of The Big Issue magazine, Paul McNamee, and sociologist Ashley Frawley. It's great to have both of you back with us. Let's dive straight into this because this is just far too juicy and we have to talk about it. So, Paul, let's go with the front page of the Sunday Times. The headline there, we can see Johnson had credit facility worth up to £800,000 while in Downing Street. So many questions going on here. Firstly, who has £800,000 to just give away? And what do they get in return? Just spill for us.
Well, according to the Sunday Times, this is a chap called Sam Bly, who's a Canadian businessman. He is the founder of Canada's biggest chain of private schools. And he is a distant cousin of Boris Johnson. Who wouldn't like a distant cousin to underwrite their lifestyle? With this story, it says that he also had his Dominican Republic villa, which he gave Boris Johnson for free to use, which is normally $5,000 a night. Again, who wouldn't like to have use of a $5,000 a night villa? I think the thing that's interesting about this is they said that Johnson used this to pay for everything from divorce payments to childcare costs, and it speaks to this particular idea of an sense of entitlement that some people believe Boris Johnson had, like he's some kind of Evelyn Waugh character. And also, given that we have heard this narrative start to play out, that Boris Johnson perhaps is waiting for his great comeback, he's waiting for Sunak to fail, and then he'll come in like the hero of the piece. Who knows exactly if that's true, but it's certainly something that's been played out. Well, why would anybody want him back if he lives in this kind of lifestyle where he doesn't take responsibility for anything and just goes to this massive credit card? It's a significant story. We don't know how much he drew down over the 2 years or so that he was in Downing Street, but he had this ability to get money, it seems, at the drop of a hat when he wanted, which also, I suppose, takes him into the normal lifestyle that a lot of people are facing the cost of living crisis.
Absolutely, and a lot of people don't have that distant cousin. I mean, I wonder if we're all related to him. Maybe we should start looking into our family tree. You never quite know, do you? Actually, let me come to you. This is a very serious story on the front page of the Sunday Express there. That headline, we can see there, spelling it out, sex assault during riot at migrant centre.
Yes, that's right. The Sunday Express is reporting that on claims that a migrant centre worker was assaulted during a riot at Britain's largest immigration removal camp last November. They also report that some refugees at the centre had tried to keep the peace and attempted to protect staff as mayhem broke out. And this is from a Home Office report that the Sunday Express has requested. This all happened after staff had requested to evacuate detainees after a loss of water and electricity, and they were refused. And it's really worrying that these kinds of awful incidents might be used to fuel further a migration panic, which in turn gives impetus to ever more inhumane policies aimed at migrants, attempting to deter them. So the idea is just to make people's lives as brutal as possible to try to stop them from coming to the UK. But study after study has shown that it doesn't actually work. And all that it does is create worse and worse situations. And it creates situations like this, where workers in these centres are put in danger, dealing with people who are pushed to the absolute brink. And it puts people in migrants in danger as they try to cross and enter into the UK via more and more difficult channels. It creates this kind of vicious circle where more and more panic is stoked, and this feeds more and more brutal policies. And it's got to end at some point. We have to realize that it's government policy, migration policy, inhumane migration policy that's causing this.
And moving on to the next story. Also in The Observer, actually, this is page 3 of The Observer. Paul, Whitehall spending tens of millions on bill to scrap EU laws. Should we be worried?
Well, I think if we are worried about massive government overspending when it isn't essential, then yes, because what this is looking at, I suppose, the Brexit cost. Everything comes at a cost, and when there's rhetoric from government about how they're going to get rid of red tape, which is always just regulation. This is the reality of it. according to this story, tens of millions have been spent on the bill to scrap the EU laws that is currently going back and forth between the Lords and the Commons, the retained EU laws bill. There's about 4,000 pieces of legislation and laws, regulations that have got to be got rid of and I suppose replaced with something. This story relates to the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It admitted it spent 600,000 in staffing costs in the last couple of months to try and find a way to get rid of these laws and regulations. However, that's less than 10% of the total that need to be got rid of. So you can see how this starts to factor up. Other government departments have been told they can't give this information. So yes, we should be worried. While the sunlit uplands of Brexit are definitely not forthcoming, there is also another cost of trying to roll out our separation from the EU. And this is just the start of it. We don't really know the cost yet, the full cost, whether it's financial or social.
And Ashley, let's talk about the NHS and let's also talk about social care, because at a time when spending for both of these areas are very, very tight, a story like this isn't going to sit very well with many people. So also staying with the Observer, page 4, their private brokers earn millions from finding care homes for NHS patients. How have we even got to this stage in the first place?
Well, how we got to this stage is sort of downstream from earlier underfunding in social care. So part of the issue is that hospitals are struggling. Well, part of the reason why hospitals are struggling at the moment, and you've seen long wait times, long times in ambulances, is because a third of hospital beds are occupied by people who are well enough to leave hospital, but because there have been difficulties identifying social care support, they're not able to leave. And so these agencies have come in which have promised to free up beds in hospital wards. Now, usually this is just done by hospitals themselves, where they will work with local areas and work with local care homes and social care to discharge patients. But these agencies have come in and said that they do they claim that they do an essential service and that they do things quickly and efficiently. But of course, the Observer is reporting that one such company, Care Home Selection Limited, the UK's biggest social care brokerage, has reported revenues increasing by up to 75% since 2018, and that they paid their most senior director £609,000 in 2021. And there are accusations that there are a lot of money they charge a lot of money for these services that might have better been spent on better planning previously on social care, so we didn't have this problem in the first place. It seems as though there's a lot of willingness to overspend or to spend quite a lot of money on these kinds of agencies and services, and less willingness to spend on training and actually paying people to do an essential service in the community, which is social care.
And this is a story that the headline, Paul, is making me laugh, this next story. Page 5 of the Mirror. This is the rise in prices for Heinz there, the bean counters. Heinz price rise puts the wind up shoppers. I mean, I personally, I'm not a beans fan, but we also have to say there are other beans available. There's also supermarket's own brand, isn't there? I mean, why are people so angry about this? So much is going up, right? So what makes Heinz any different?
This is a story that seems to have been written just for that subtext headline, just so that they can have the idea of wind attached to beans, because it's been going around for over a year, that particularly Heinz and the price rise of Heinz beans, and how some people are very attached to their beans, and particularly Heinz. There's a lot of brand loyalty, and you're right, there are own brands as well, but Heinz seems to be the one.
We're just running out of time. Oh, the wind. Just what a shame. Thank you so much indeed, Paul and Ashley. Thank you so much. We'll see you after this break.